columnist Sebastian Mallaby profiles World Bank President James Wolfensohn in the new book, The World's Banker. Wednesday, the author sat down with the Wall Street Journal's David Wessel at the Council on Foreign Relations. The program's an hour.
Good morning. Welcome to this very special event where I get a chance to pick at Sebastian's book and he has to respond. And I can't promise you it'll be as much fun as the vice presidential debates, but I'll do my part if Sebastian does his. I want to thank the Council for asking me to do this because it forced me to do something that is too easy to put off, which is read a book you mean to read. And I really enjoyed reading Sebastian's book. In journalism, editors sometimes refer to stories as DBI, dull but important. And it's probably not true in this room, but in most American newspapers, the World Bank is right up there in the top 5 DBI topics. And what Sebastian has done in this book is discover that there's a wonderful character at the center of the World Bank, Jim Wolfensohn, and made it quite easy to read the book. So I recommend it to all of you, and I'm not saying that just because I happen to be sitting here. Sebastian, as many of you know, has been a Washington Post columnist since 1999. Before that, he spent 13 years on the staff of The Economist in Zimbabwe and London, Japan, and then finally in Washington. He was trained in Oxford, where he obviously learned a lot, but he writes in the back of the book that he also prepared for this assignment after college by working for 2 months as a truck driver's assistant in Chile, after which he rode buses up the western spine of South America through Peru, Ecuador, Bolivia, and Brazil, and once even read his own name on a missing persons notice in Peru. But fortunately, he was found. Now, if any of you have ever been asked to moderate one of these Council on Foreign Relations events, you will know that this turns out to be the single most organized institution in Washington. If the Council on Foreign Relations ran Homeland Security, we wouldn't have to worry about terrorism anymore. So I'm instructed to tell you that you should turn off your cell phones, that unlike most council meetings, this one is on the record, that we'll begin first with about 20-25 minutes of questions by me and answers by Sebastian, and then we'll open it up for questions from those of you who are in the audience. And I'm going to read this one verbatim. We will end promptly at 9:30 a.m., and as a courtesy to our speakers, we ask that you not leave the meeting early. And seeing how organized the council is, I'm sure there will be some penalty to be paid if you dare step out the door before then. Sebastian, let me start by asking you to describe a little bit what you mean when you write in the book that Jim Wolfensohn subscribes to the hand grenade theory of management.
Okay. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank the folks here at Case Western University for organizing this debate. No, thank you to the Council on Foreign Relations, is what I meant to say. The hand grenade theory of management. When Wolfensohn came to the bank in 1995, he came out of the private sector. He'd been a banker. He'd run his own private bank for a long time on Wall Street, and before that he'd been at Salomon Brothers and made his name by leading the Chrysler bailout in 1979. Now, the atmosphere of Salomon Brothers, you can imagine from Liar's Poker. I mean, it was not a kind of polite, sort of softly spoken sort of place. There were morning meetings, as Wolfensohn describes them, where, the cigar ash would be flying, the curses would be loud, the coffee would be spilt all over the place, it would be a really humdinger of a fight. And then at lunchtime, a client would come in from the outside, and all the partners who'd been throwing coffee at each other in the morning would suddenly kind of line up. They'd all be totally, they kind of team. And when Wolfensohn came to the World Bank, he sort of brought some of that style, which I think is his personal style anyway, to the job of running the World Bank, a public institution. Now, the difference is that if you yell at people and throw stuff at them and so forth, and then at Christmas time, they get a bonus, which is in, the 6 or 7 figures, they're kind of okay with that. But at the World Bank, if you yell at people and they've got economics PhDs and they're not going to get any bonus, they kind of say, well, what do you know about development? And so there was this clash between this larger-than-life kind of tornado figure and this very proud institution, the World Bank. And Wolfensohn was sort of so determined to shake it up that it kind of felt like a hand grenade had been lobbed right into the middle of the building.
And do you think that the bank needed a little bit of that?
Well, one of the toughest things when I was doing this book was to figure out, where the truth lay and in how much the institution did need a shake-up, how much it didn't. And I think what was going on in the 90s is that, that there was some need for some discrete things to be fixed. But in 1995, when Wilson came, and in the next couple of years, remember we were going through the financial bubble was starting to inflate. The private sector's prestige was at an all-time high. So you had not only a financial bubble, but a kind of psychological bubble as to what people believed private sector efficiency really was. And so there was a perception that, you come to the World Bank, you can import that private sector prowess, apply it to a public sector institution, and zing, this thing will, get up and start doing extraordinary stuff that it never did before. Well, I mean, it doesn't work like that. The World Bank has a board that meets twice a week, formally, informally on other days as well. And no private sector institution could be lean, mean, and fast if it had that kind of oversight with multiple mandates and so forth. So I think that Wolfenson greatly exaggerated how much the bank needed the hand grenade treatment. And he sort of broke a lot of heads trying to fix something which couldn't be fixed as much as he really thought it could.
Now, one chapter in the book, which is actually quite moving, is your description of the World Bank in Bosnia. And what struck me was that it was a model of doing the right thing at the right time and not relying on the cookbook. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that and then draw the contrast, if you will, to the World Bank's role in Iraq, which certainly needs some fixing as well.
Right. Well, Bosnia was a remarkable case because the World Bank got into Bosnia extremely early. The first mission into Bosnia went in sort of within days of the ceasefire being announced in October 1995. And even before that, there'd been meetings where the Bosnian Muslim leaders had escaped out of Sarajevo through a tunnel which went under the airport and climbed up the mountains and got to Poland, where there were meetings on reconstruction with World Bank officials. So there was this early bond with these besieged Bosniak leaders. So the World Bank team was extremely committed to acting fast once the ceasefire came. The World Bank director for that part of the world was at the Dayton Peace Accords, and I actually think that the peace accords would not have happened if it hadn't been for her presence, because every time the Bosniak Muslims wanted to walk out, the carrot to kind of keep them at the table was, here's the World Bank, they've risked their lives, these people, by flying into your capital when the snipers are still in action. And if you sign this peace deal, they are committed to delivering serious reconstruction.
And you make the point that this was a deliberate stratagem by Holbrooke, you think?
That's right. I mean, Holbrooke and David Lipton at the Treasury at the time had brought the bank in very early to get that to happen. And it helped that, in the Clinton Treasury, there was not only Larry Summers, who had been the chief economist at the World Bank, but David Lipton, who'd been at the International Monetary Fund, knew these institutions inside out, knew exactly how to push their buttons and make them do things which would promote US interests. And so they could do that very early on. Now, the contrast with Iraq is that when it came time to plan reconstruction, the Bush Treasury was slower in approaching the bank and less good at doing it kind of informally at first, making a contact which would not be seen as presumptuous. It's been argued to me by the current Treasury that, look, we couldn't go to the World Bank until after the war. Obviously, you have to do the invasion first, and then you do the reconstruction. Well, I mean, you could do parallel planning if you've got the kind of relationship between the US Treasury and the World Bank that enables the United States to use this institution as a tool of American foreign policy. It doesn't happen unless you sort of know how to do it.
Now, in the book, you make the point that the World Bank basically has two big businesses. One is lending to countries that basically could borrow on their own, Brazil, India, and China. They make money on that, which they use to finance their operations. And the other is the basically loans to very poor countries, the so-called IDA program. Some of the loans never get paid back. Some people think they ought to be declared grants in the first place. And it's a very delicate balance. The first requires a good credit rating so you could borrow money to lend to China. The second requires the largesse of the Congress and the parliaments around the world. Is this a sustainable model, or is it under attack now?
Well, there are two sources of threat to this model. On the commercial lending side, the lending to countries like Brazil, China, which can go to the private capital markets, the problem is that traditionally the bank has been able to lend to those countries because it has a AAA credit rating and it's not trying to make a profit. It's trying to cover its costs but not make a profit. So it lends at a small spread over its cost of capital, and that's cheaper than Citigroup would lend to these countries. But the thing is that the World Bank has become so cautious and careful about dotting every I and crossing every T when it comes to getting the environmental impact study right, getting the social impact study right, so that if you do a dam or something, the people who are moved are treated properly. I mean, all of these very good values which have been built into bank projects have been pushed to the extent that it can take years and years and years to get the project off the ground. And at a certain point, the borrowers say, look, I'd rather borrow from Citigroup and pay a bit more on my money, but do the project twice as quickly. So that's the threat on that commercial business. And you see it in the numbers. The portfolio has declined a lot in the last 5 or 7 years. And that was disguised for a while by the Asian financial crisis, where there was a lot of non-project lending. But basically, there is a medium-term threat, which the bank is trying to fix by speeding itself up. But so long as there's a lot of pressure from civil society to be extra careful on these environmental and social issues, it's not clear the bank can escape that box. On the other side, you're right, that with the soft loans, the IDA loans, these are to the very, very poor countries, which often wind up not being able to repay. And we've now had already 2 rounds of debt relief. In 1996 was HIPIC 1, in 1999 came HIPIC 2, and now at the annual meetings just finished, we've had discussion of a 3rd round of debt relief for these same borrowers. At a certain point, if you lend money and then you don't get paid back and you forgive it, you have to call a grant. I mean, it is basically a grant, and you should call it that. But if you do that, that raises questions about, you're depriving yourself of the money you would have been paid back, and so there's a hole in your balance sheet, and so there's a threat to that side of your operation too.
Now, some people would say, well, so what? It's a good news that the world capital markets have evolved and emerging markets are now able to borrow, and maybe the World Bank has outlived its usefulness in those things. I mean, and then, so why should we worry if the World Bank is forced to shrink because the markets have found ways to do what it was set up to do?
Well, I think, in good times, that argument has a certain plausibility. You could say that so long as China can borrow from Citigroup, the government can issue, bonds in Europe and raise money. If it wants to finance anti-poverty projects, it can raise the money and spend that money on water systems for poor people. If it doesn't want to do that commercially, that means it's not really motivated. So why should we kid ourselves that a public institution giving them the money will really change their motivation? So I think that's a plausible case. But there are two other big qualifiers. One is that you do get stuff like the Asian financial crisis, or Brazil's crisis, or Russia's crisis, right? Where it actually is important for Western interests to be able to stabilize countries that are falling apart, and having an institution with a very large balance sheet and a lot of capital it can throw in to back up IMF-led bailouts is a useful policy tool, and I don't see why we should get rid of it. I mean, it's not costing us anything, this commercial side of the operation. It doesn't cost taxpayers anything, so why get rid of it? And the second thing is just sort of intuitively, I mean, you have this institution which has been around now for 60 years, which has done projects in 100 countries, which is the biggest sort of concentration of thinking and expertise and sophistication on the toughest problems that we will face, from AIDS to what you do about institution building, all these things. It's the biggest source of sort of public goods creation in this field. Why mess with it? Why, I mean, you can argue that it's not as needed as it was before, but I see no cost in keeping it on.
Now, I suppose the real test, though, is are poor people around the world better off for the World Bank? And in particular, are poor people better off because of the things that Jim Wolfensohn did at the bank, or not?
Well, at the core of your question is one of the toughest things about development and about defending development in front of, skeptical, rightly skeptical taxpayers. Because the truth about development is that, it's a partnership always between the external actors, the donors, the World Bank or USAID or whoever, and the domestic players, the politicians, who are actually implementing policy in these countries. So if you look at a country like Uganda, as I do in my book, which cut poverty by 40% in the 1990s, and you ask, what did the World Bank do? And I asked this question to every policymaker on the Ugandan side that dealt with the bank and every bank person that dealt with Uganda and with other donors as well who are into the mix and so on. I mean, I took it from all angles, trying to isolate what did the World Bank do? And the answer is that the big picture of progress, of 40% cut in poverty, is clearly done by Ugandan policymakers. And there's a great character in this chapter called Emmanuel Tumusimi Mutabili, who is this larger-than-life, sort of hard-drinking, tough, brilliant technocrat who basically ran the finance ministry during this period. And he didn't take nonsense from any donor. He told them to get lost if he didn't agree with their advice. And he drove Uganda's progress, and I give him most of the credit. But that doesn't mean that the World Bank was unimportant, because he couldn't have done everything he did if the bank hadn't come in and given him money quickly when he wanted to do universal primary education. He couldn't have done something which is an extraordinary little vignette, where the World Bank wanted to figure out what happened to local schools. How come they weren't increasing enrollment, whereas the central government's budget seemed to be transferring money to these local schools? Where did the money go? So the World Bank designed this survey where they looked at the central government's books, figured out how much money was supposed to go to each school, sent surveyors to go ask the schools how much they'd gotten, and figured out that the median school in the survey had got 0%. 0% had got to them because it had all been ripped off by the middle level of the government. And then this information was posted on the doors of the schoolrooms saying, you should have gotten this much. And they resurveyed 5 years later, and it had gone up to 70% or something. Now that's an example of a sort of technical thing which took a World Bank person who knew how to do spreadsheets, knew how to design surveys, knew how to crunch numbers. And so you find these sort of micro examples of how the technical expertise can change things. But most of the time, it's a partnership. If something good happens, partly it's the government that did it, partly it's the World Bank that did it, partly it's some visiting economist from Harvard who happened to have an idea. I mean, it's terribly difficult to put your finger on it, and that's why when Paul O'Neill or somebody like that says, show me what you've done, it can be hard to come up with a sort of crisp answer.
Now, one of the things that you describe quite well is how Wolfenson forced the bank to stop looking at non-governmental organizations, NGOs, as if they were the enemy, and to somehow smother them with love in the hopes that they would appreciate that in the end, actually, they had similar goals to the bank, which wasn't set up, of course, to destroy environments or to enrich bondholders, but to help poor people. But as you point out in the book, perhaps the romance of the NGO, the disinterested, only out for the good of the people NGO, is one that we in the press have created and isn't justified by the facts.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can see the World Bank in this period, starting about 10 years ago, as kind of a case study in what you do about being encircled by a critical civil society. In 1994, we didn't have the term anti-globalization protests, but we had the reality of them, and that's what happened at the World Bank's 50th anniversary meetings in Madrid. The cry was 50 years is enough. The Madrid annual meetings descended into complete chaos, and then 9 months later, along comes Wolfenson as the new World Bank president and makes it his absolutely top priority to reach out to these critics, to bring them into the tent, to try and see what they want and give them what's reasonable and kind of create a peace. And he did this partly in personal ways, and he is a guy who made more than $100 million on Wall Street by winning people over and doing deals, and so he's pretty good at this. And there was a particular case of Bruce Rich from the Environmental Defense Fund, who had written a book attacking the bank the year before Wolfenson arrived, and the World Bank's External Relations Department had prepared a long memo saying why all of this was wrong and it was nonsense and so forth. And when Wolfenson came in, he invited Bruce Rich to his supper, to his house for dinner, and sort of, brought him in and brought his vice presidents there to listen, and really made an effort to convey the idea that the bank was going to listen to these critics. And it was done in substantive ways as well, so that in 1999, it was decreed that if you want to get soft loans from the World Bank, your country has to have a development plan which is created by a participatory process, bringing the NGOs to the table so that they can have their input. And it's hard to think of what more an institution could do. And yet, when the Seattle protests broke out in November or December of 1999, I remember reading in places that Other institutions like the World Trade Organization had now got it in the neck. International Monetary Fund would be next, but the World Bank had spent 5 years building bridges. World Bank would be okay. Was it okay? No. Spring meetings of 2000 is totally encircled by protesters. Autumn meetings of 2000, again, complete chaos. And meanwhile, the actual projects that the bank do, and I have some quite juicy examples in the book, are also being attacked by civil society. And that's, and in a way that suggests that they didn't always, take into account the fact that efforts towards the environment to displace people and so forth have been greatly improved. So I think that, what this teaches is that you can't expect to make complete peace with NGOs, and that you have to sometimes be critical about, you can't start from the presumption that, the criticisms are all reasonable, that you can win people over if you're only reasonable yourself. And I do think that the media and sort of congressional staffers need to treat what civil society says, what NGOs say, with a bit more skepticism than they traditionally do.
Now, my final question, this is my favorite passage in the book, and for those of you who will never read the whole thing, it's page 170 and 171. And you describe in November 1997, the French representative on the bank board is leaving, and he turns out to be less than enthusiastic about Jim Wolfenson's leadership. And you describe him giving what I'm sure was a very articulate speech, and I hope it was recorded on video because I'd love to see it with the original French accent. And finally, when he reaches his climax, he says, "Could we think of a better allegory of the bank than Narcissus, the handsome, self-infatuated, doomed hero of Greek mythology who drowned himself while kissing his own image reflected in the water?" He looked around at his colleagues. He recites a poem. Othman left his poem hanging out there in the air without saying what he meant by it. The figures around the table seemed to freeze, and so on. You can read the rest. So my question to you is, what is it like to write a book about a guy who has this kind of reputation with his colleagues?
Well, it was I began on this project with basically an interest in development, which is going back 20 years, traveling around Latin America and so forth, being the Economist correspondent in Africa for a while and so on. And then the second impulse was, well, after 9/11, the concern for failed states is not just a sort of minority interest. There might be a bigger audience for a book about development issues. But as I got into the project, I realized that my central character, Jim Wolfenson, it was this extraordinary mix of, amazingly positive qualities and then some quite serious negative ones. And as I went around talking to people, 200 interviews of people who sort of interacted with him, I would get long speeches about how this was the most charming, committed, wonderful person they'd ever met, who really cares about the fact that half of humanity lives on $2 a day, and he has this, he's the, and you have that. And then also, this is a psychopath, a narcissist, that they are extreme. And when I gave the manuscript to a friend at one point, he read it and said he couldn't figure out which of these ones was dominant. Was it, on the one hand, a sort of noble figure like Ben Kingsley? Or was it Danny DeVito? And the thing is that he's both, and the process of following him, was enthralling. There's one of the stories which I like to tell is right when I was beginning the research, I wanted to get some access to him and sort of get to meet him, and I was told, well, if you want to meet him, please go to Canterbury, which I thought was slightly strange because he's in Washington, I'm in Washington, we could just meet in Washington. But no, go to Canterbury. So I flew to London and went to Canterbury, and in the shadow of the cathedral there was a little seminar room, and I walked in, and there at the head of the table, hosting the seminar, was Jim Wolfenson, sitting next to the Archbishop of Canterbury with his purple shirt. And next to the Archbishop of Canterbury, there was Swami Agnivesh with an orange turban, a Hindu mystic. And next to Swami Agnivesh, there was Bono with black sunglasses. And I figured anybody who can put this kind of coalition together is not a boring guy. And it was a great experience trying to figure out his psychology, extreme in both directions, while I was doing the book.
Well, thank you. I think we want to open it up to questions. There's a mic floating around, and you should use it, especially for C-SPAN. Please stand when you ask a question. Give us your name and your affiliation. And remember, the idea is to ask questions, not to give speeches. Would anybody like to go first, or else you'll have to hear me talk some more? Please, the woman here.
Hattie Babbitt from Hunt Alternatives Fund. You said that in the beginning that the toughest job was sifting through the facts to find out where the truth lay. Having done that, what should the next World Bank president do? I mean, what did you learn about the functioning of the bank as opposed to the functioning of Jim Wolfenson that would guide the next president?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that there are certain qualities the next World Bank president ought to have. You need to be a fantastic communicator because the bank remains an institution under siege from critics of all kinds, and you need Wolfenson-style communication skills. And some people, like the previous president, Lou Preston, did not have those, and that was a significant problem. The second thing you need is to be able to manage a big public sector institution, which is different to a private sector one. And so I think somebody with experience of doing that is important. And the third thing you want is somebody who actually has spent some time thinking about development, who is fluent already in the concepts and doesn't kind of have come to it with a reinvent the wheel kind of idea, because you can waste enormous amounts of time by kind of arriving and say, I know what, microcredit, or I know what, it's all about girls' education. Because these things have been around, and wasting time sort of, you know, on these silver bullets is a big pitfall in development. It happens all the time. So I think those are the three qualities that one needs to look for. And I'd say that my big strategic advice to the next president of the World Bank, and this is sort of will be a live question fairly soon because Wolfenson's term is up at the end of May next year, is essentially, look, you've got a choice. On the one hand, you've got these northerners, both civil society and governments, giving you mandates all the time, trying to make you kind of the secretariat of northern ambitions. And so the G7 will meet every year and say, this year, guys, you know, the thing is HIV/AIDS. And then they'll meet the next year and they'll say, no, the thing is that we absolutely have to do something about girls' education. And the next year it will be, well, we're very worried about those frontline states around Afghanistan. Please can you do something about theirs? And it'll go on like that. And meanwhile, civil society will be saying, no damage to Tibet, no damage to rainforests, no damage to the environment. No, you know, and you know, you can't just ignore that stuff because you do need the IDA replenishments, the money for the soft loan window every 3 years. But your real job, insofar as you can, is to chill them out. Chill them out. And focus on the borrowers, on the poor countries you're meant to be helping. Go to them and say, what is it we can do to help you? And then try and deliver the best technical advice you can to these poor countries. So that if you imagine the bank as a circle with these two northern stakeholders on the top and the southern borrowers, the poor borrowers on the bottom, try to close your ears to the north as much as possible and focus on the people you should really be helping.
Thank you. Gentleman here in the aisle.
Follow up on her question. Zygmunt Nagorski, Center for International Leadership. Following on the question, you have identified Wolfenson with the bank. For the next president, it will be very difficult to go into his shoes and try to follow the pattern. But one thing which, I don't know, I haven't read the book, I read only the reviews. One thing which was missing in what you said was the fact that Wolfenson brought passion to his job, passion and complete commitment to the issue of development. And this is where the negative parts come. A passionate person, a creative person, and he is because he's a musician as well, occasionally loses his patience. And as you know very well, being a journalist yourself, when you lose your patience, you have to control yourself. Well, it was very difficult to control yourself when you are on top of the pile. And he was on top of the pile, and he is. So I think that the justice to Wolfenson and to the bank would be for you to say he has a passion, he is excused for his negative aspects, but he has contributed to the development to a great degree. And the legacy of Wolfenson for the next guy would be come with passion, maybe control it, but don't be a bureaucrat and faceless individual.
I would say, why don't you pass the mic over here? I would say that you don't need to read the book because you've pretty much absorbed it and summarized it much better than I did.
There's a lot of truth in that. I mean, what you say, I mean, he did definitely come to the job with passion. There's a great quote which he gave in a profile in the Financial Times after a year or so in the job where he said, you know, development is like a love. a new love. I wake up in the morning thinking about it. I go to bed at night thinking about it. It's a passion that grows. I mean, it's a romantic attachment to this thing. And, you know, he is absolutely worked up about the fact that this is the biggest injustice in the world. He is tackling the biggest and most pressing and most morally compelling issues in the world. I totally agree with you that he has that enormous passion. And I think it is great. Now, he also has some negatives. He has a temper, he has a thin skin, and so forth. And that sometimes got in the way of good judgment and made him a less effective president than he could have been. Now, what's the net? I say to people sometimes, look, Wolfenson is like a current account surplus. You know, he's net positive, right? But there are two enormous, great big numbers up here, and the negative is quite big, even if the positive is even bigger. That's how I think I would think about it.
It's the first time I ever heard, well, give the mic to Paula Stern. It's the first time I ever heard anybody use the current account surplus as a metaphor to explain someone's impact on society.
That was great. Paula Stern, the Stern Group. I'd like to talk and hear more about corruption and how Mr. Wolfenson deals with corruption in these countries when the corruption is at the very top. He has to be concerned about currying favor, both with the U.S. administration, which is concerned about frontline states, and as you said, the G7, if it's the flavor of the year, to be concerned about frontline states. He also has to be concerned about thinking about being reappointed. And he also has to be concerned about getting the World Bank's bigger message about development and fighting corruption through to some of these heads of state. How do you think he's handled himself on that? And do you have suggestions about how, as Hattie suggested along the lines, a future World Bank president would deal with this very ugly issue of corruption?
Right. That's a great question. I mean, it's an opening into lots of things in the book. You know, to the extent that this is sort of an intellectual quest novel, the quest is, you know, how do you turn a sliver of the rich world's wealth into progress against poverty? The quest takes you in, you know, kind of, if you think about development in the big sweep of history, you know, you start off in the 50s doing physical infrastructure, the physical capital. Then in the 60s and 70s, it becomes human capital, so health, education. Then by the 90s, it's become social capital. So it's about institutions, how they function, getting participation right, accountability, transparency, and corruption is a central part of that. And one of the things that Wolfenson did is that he did make a speech about the cancer of corruption in the fall of 1996 and put it on the map in a way that I think it had been a little bit under McNamara, but it had definitely faded out by the early 90s. There are all sorts of stories about World Bank officials wanting to talk about corruption in the early 90s and being told by the general counsel of the bank that you can't do that. The articles of agreement of the bank say this is an economic institution. Do not mention the C word. And when Wolfenson came into office, he said, I'm going to talk about corruption. And his staff said, no, you can't do that. He said, I'm the president. I'll do what I want. And he did it. So I give him credit for that in the book. But the tough issue is, so how do you implement that? And my case study on that is Indonesia, where you know, he came in 95 and went to Jakarta in 96 and came back saying, look, this is out of control. I mean, we used to have a situation where the president's wife, Madame Tien, was joked about Madame 10%, right? But now it's way over 10%, and all the kids are stealing money hand over fist. You know, this is ridiculous. But the problem was that the bank's country team in Indonesia were having a debate about the same issue. You know, should we confront the Indonesians? How much should we? Should we threaten to pull loans if they don't do something about this corruption? And the verdict of the experts dealing with Indonesia was, look, this country is cutting poverty by hundreds of thousands of people per year. I mean, an extraordinary rate of progress against poverty. I mean, Oxfam in 1994 put out a paper on the Indonesian model for cutting poverty. I mean, it was the darling of poverty. So do we really want to pull out of this country, which is doing such fantastic? Isn't corruption in the grand scale of things kind of like saying that, you know, your education policy isn't that great because you're spending too much on high schools, not enough on primary schools, and, you know, exactly, we didn't like the corruption, but, I mean, you know, is the fact that 25% of your money is ripped off in a particular project worse or better than if you go to India and you make the same loan, they don't rip off that much, but the whole project fails because nobody builds the, you know, the road you're trying to make or something. So that was the thinking, and I think the Indonesian team kind of for understandable reasons decided corruption is bad, but not so bad that we're going to get out of here or really, really lay down, throw down the gauntlet. And then, of course, in 1997, the financial crisis starts. In 1998, Suharto is thrown out of power, primarily because of corruption. I mean, the financial crisis didn't begin because of corruption, but I explained in the book that it could not be controlled because the institutions of state were so corrupt in Indonesia that there was, every time you tried to get a handle on the financial stuff, the money was flying out of the back of the central bank to, Suharto's friends, and any kind of monetary policy was undermined by that. So corruption was proven to be, on the level of sort of hyperinflation or something which is so serious to your development prospects that it basically wipes out everything else. And probably they should have pulled out. But telling that before the fact is incredibly hard. And I think that's, the issue with corruption is not just, oh, it's tough to go to a head of state and say you're corrupt. Because Wolfenson actually did that. The issue is more, so what do you do? Do you pull out? That's the hard thing.
There's a question over here.
John Alterman, CSIS. I want to ask you about the culture of the bank. My friends at the bank complained to me that not only is the bank bureaucratic in many ways, but because it's populated by so many third world elites, it's bureaucratic in third world kind of ways. There are managers who are micromanagers, they're secretive, they're not open to ideas, that there's something wrong about the institution, partly because of who the institution grows out of. Is it your sense that there is something wrong with the culture of the place? How much can the president do to change that, and how successful has Wolfenson been at addressing those kinds of problems?
Yeah, I mean, there's some truth to that, and that was definitely, in a big way, his perception when he arrived, and that's why he would walk down the corridor in his early days and accost some, random manager and say, I'm surprised you're still here, and then leave the guy to figure out if he'd just been fired or something. I mean, that was the hand grenade theory of management. He really shook it up. I mean, I think half the senior staff left, huge numbers of people were pushed out. I mean, really confrontational attempt to fix the problem you described. Now, the fact that you're still describing it tells you something about whether it's possible to really fix it, and whether it's smart to kind of turn the institution upside down, shake it very hard, and then kick it in hope of improving it. If you don't improve it after all that, you've caused a lot of disruption without...
But what about, didn't he move a lot of people out of Washington into the borrowing countries?
Yeah, that was a very good innovation. When he began, all the country directors, who were the kind of key people controlling the budget, were based in headquarters. By now, something like 2/3 are out in the field. That is a big improvement because it makes it more likely that the thing I described earlier about chilling out the north and listening to the south is going to happen. If your directors are actually based in the field, I think they put the relationship with the host government and trying to help that host government higher up on their agenda. So that was a very good innovation.
Over here in the pink shirt.
Mark Leland Associate. Well, I'm an old friend of Jim's, and I'm on the side of the admirers of the passion. I think one of the things was, I remember I was at the Treasury in the early 80s, and Reagan, he wanted to be head of the World Bank in 1980. We actually worked on it. And he became an American citizen at great expense, actually, and he didn't have a lot of money. I mean, one talks about he made the money after. We always say one of the luckiest things for him was it didn't happen. But he then had much more experience, so it is a passion of his, of something he wanted to do. My question, and I've kind of watched it, I mean, the one thing those of us who were for him was the one element you didn't mention in your answer about the next president, which is the private sector. I mean, the one thing about Jim, which was not a barbicanable, and I don't know how much you do go into the book, because I waited to hear you till I read it. He didn't really want me to buy it, but I bought it.
Good friendship comes to an end.
But I will absorb it. But looking at this, because the one factor, I mean, one of the things in the Reagan administration you worked at was trying to get co-financing, which I gather from your earlier answer, working with the World Bank is so bureaucratic, as you said, that was one of these kind of things that one gave up. But the great hope for him was to promote the private sector, to kind of shake it up, that there would be a greater involvement. Now, of course, I sometimes jokingly say that he should have the job Mark Malloch Brown has, and Mark Malloch Brown should have the job he has, because Mark is really working on private sector initiatives in the UNDP. And what I'm trying to get at in my question is, how important do you think the World Bank's role in promoting the private sector is, and how well do you think Jim has accomplished that job? Because I think we have no question as to his passion, and no question as to the fact that he really was trying to do, I think you don't either, I'm asking this as a question, that he was really trying to do something, and it's hard to do it in an institution that it's, you know, that's very hard to fire anybody. So when you gave a description of somebody that to me may frighten me. I mean, this is just going to be a public sector kind of guy that's spent his career in development and so forth, and if he gets into that kind of bank where everybody else is like that, what's he going to do?
Well, I mean, if the question is, you know, how many partnerships can the bank forge with the private sector in the third world doing projects together, then I think, you know, there's lots of scope for that because, I mean, I have an example of this in my book with the Chad-Cameroon pipeline. You know, Exxon wanted to develop oil in Chad, but the political risk of investing in Chad was enormous, and you couldn't get any commercial bank to lend to you to do a pipeline in this country which was sort of unstable and so forth, and you could be expropriated, national, you know. So therefore, they came to the World Bank on the theory that if the World Bank put skin in the game, then for the Chadian government to come and nationalize you would be kind of tricky, because then you would be cutting off all your aid access, all your donors would walk out the door. And so the World Bank did come in on that. And they also came in because the other political risk was civil society, criticism on the environment and so forth. And Exxon realized that if you had the bank involved and sort of bank environmental standards imposed on this pipeline, it would be much easier to defend it in the public forum. And so you had this partnership between, you know, the kind of slightly slow bureaucracy with all its sort of, you know, careful caution, and a kind of gung-ho private sector operator, which worked pretty well. And when I went to Chad to look at this thing, you know, you arrive in the middle of nowhere, and it looks as if, you know, a magic carpet somewhere outside of Houston has been, you know, flown all the way, like that, landed in the middle of Africa in this landlocked country, and there are these big guys with twanging accents and oil derricks and so forth. And I mean, the awesome power of a determined multinational when it wants to make something happen. You know, there's no transport in Chad. You can't go from the capital to the oil site. What do? They have a private air service to bring people. There's no road, so they build a road. You know, any problem that Exxon confronted basically fixed in short order. And that was a terrific combination. The project got off the ground, partly because of this muscle and this focus of Exxon, and partly because of the political skills of the World Bank. And that was a good combination. It has been happening a bit. And I think, you know, to your question, one of the things we've seen recently is that the Equator Principles, developed by the International Finance Corporation, which is part of the World Bank, of course, have been adopted by commercial banks so that future lending in these controversial projects will be on standards which have been effectively developed by the Jim Wolfensohn World Bank. So I think he has made some strides in that area.
Well, the question was, does he think the next person should be private sector?
Yeah. You know, I have mixed feelings about that. I mean, I can see why you think that, you know, you want the private sector energy and so forth. You don't want to have a bureaucrat on top of a bureaucratic organization. But I personally think that the costs of having a private sector person who comes in thinking that this can be run like a private, it's not McKinsey, it's not Goldman Sachs, it never will be. And if you think it can be, you're going to waste a lot of time banging your head against a wall and trying to do stuff which just, I mean, you know, people don't understand that the governance problems, the bureaucracy about the bank and so forth, is largely driven externally. It's the fact that you have civil society with its foot on your neck. It's the fact that you have shareholders with its foot on your neck. This is why you can't run a public sector organization like Goldman Sachs. And people who don't get that waste a lot of time.
On the aisle there.
Alan Wendt, could you tell us something about Wolfenson's attitude towards the IFC and the role the IFC has played under his tenure? I ask the question because I've heard it suggested that under Wolfenson, the IFC has been pushed more and more into questionable projects, that is, projects that really wouldn't meet the standards of a bank lending on basically commercial terms, which is what the IFC does. this under Peter Voika, who I believe was brought into the IFC by Wolfenson. I don't know if you address this in your book. I haven't read it yet, but what could you tell us about the role of the IFC in Wolfenson's thinking?
And for people who don't know, why don't you just give the two-sentence explanation of what the International Finance Corp is?
Sure. Well, I mean, the two other parts of the World Bank, the soft loan window and the commercial loan window, have it in common that they only lend to governments, whereas the IFC can lend directly to private sector projects. And that's the International Finance Corporation, and it's supposed to put money into stuff like the Chad-Cameroon pipeline, where it can lend to a consortium as opposed to a central government. Now, Peter Voika, the head of the IFC, came from JP Morgan. So if you want a private sector guy, you've got a private sector guy. I mean, he was not a guy who, he'd done commercial lending on a grand scale in Asia. He knows all about that stuff. So the idea that he doesn't get it, wasn't trying, and so forth, obviously that would be wrong. I think what has happened, the biggest thing that's happened about the IFC in the period I cover, is essentially that there was this period when it was assumed that, look, the private sector proper is going to finance infrastructure. That, the Argentina model of, privatizing telecoms, privatizing these utilities, would be replicated around the world, somewhat a bit slower than Argentina, but essentially this was, the bank could get out of infrastructure. And this was compounded by the desire to get out of infrastructure, because infrastructure involves concrete, therefore it involves environmental questions, therefore it involves huge political risk with the civil society. So for these combined reasons, both the bank's public relations and this sort of late 90s private sector boom, the bank withdrew from financing infrastructure. And I think that was a huge mistake. If you think about what is the niche of a multinational lender like the World Bank, with multi-sectoral expertise which spans engineering, long-term financial calculations, macroeconomics, environmental impact studies, this is the World Bank. And so I think, it's precisely for these big infrastructure projects that the bank is needed, and the IFC ought to be at the heart of that. And they did take their eye off the ball for a while because of this perception of a private sector taking the problem off their hands.
Over here, and then on the aisle.
Eugene Moran's with Cleary Gottlieb, Steen and Hamilton in Washington. Back to NGOs. The Asian Development Bank and other regional development banks have begun cooperating with NGOs by giving them technical assistance grants and other grants to help them build development from the ground up. Do you think the World Bank has given enough attention to working directly with NGOs, helping fund them, and seeing what role they can play, particularly in socially oriented programs?
Yeah. The answer is that the World Bank has done this enormously. I mean, it's done masses of it. It's done enormous amounts of cooperation with NGOs, incredible focus on social projects. The idea that it's mainly doing, as I was saying before, infrastructure and these traditional bank projects is kind of 20 years or 15 years out of date. So there's been every effort you can imagine to participate with NGOs, do projects together with them, give them money so that they can be partners and so forth. You name it, they've tried it. They've tried it on a grand scale. The fact that they are still criticized by NGOs show that the Asian Development Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank are kidding themselves if they think this will buy them political cover. It won't. We've seen the case study with the World Bank in the last decade.
There's a question on the aisle here, and let me ask one quick one while the mic's getting there. So let's do the counterfactual. Let's say that Jim Wolfenson wasn't president of the World Bank, and Larry Summers, the former Treasury Secretary, the president of Harvard, who also wanted the job, had gotten it. Would that have been different, better, worse?
Yes. It would have been different, better, and worse, I guess.
Right answer.
Michael Gillette, a private citizen, retired from pre-Wolfenson World Bank. I hang out with people in financial circles these days, as do you. You know, those folks like to criticize other folks active in the financial sector, and Jim Wolfenson is no exception.
I don't think this is limited to finance, this
No.
Human behavior.
A standard criticism is that Wolfie rushed into transitioning Russia and placed an enormous bet on the success of the Russian transition, which now sits in the World Bank's balance sheet as a major threat. How do you assess the accusation that he did this recklessly, which is a word often used, and how do you appraise the Russian risk in the bank's balance sheet?
That's a good question. I mean, it's certainly true that in early '95, when the Clinton administration was thinking about who it should choose to run the World Bank, one of the things on the administration's mind was, we need somebody who will do what we want in Russia. Because Lou Preston, the previous president, had been rather reluctant to go finance Russia for precisely the reasons that you describe. Because the administration had wanted to support Yeltsin, they took the opposite view. Now, when Wilkinson came in, he did pour money in there. There were internal fights about how much. There was quite a lot of tension between him and some of his lieutenants about, one would say, okay, I'm going to be tough, and then he would feel that the other one had let them down. Either whoever had the meeting most recently with Yeltsin was most likely to have caved. And clearly in retrospect, this was a bad bet. Whether prospectively it was so obvious, I think is difficult. I mean, you had to balance the political risk of not supporting Yeltsin, obviously, with the financial risk of doing so. And, I think at the time, a lot of reasonable people would have said this is a risk that the World Bank ought to take. If the World Bank doesn't take this kind of risk, what's the point of it? We have this institution so that we can make some calls. And on the residual effect on the portfolio, I don't get the sense at the bank that it's a big deal. I mean, I think that, unlike the IMF, which has made huge bets on 3 countries, Turkey, Argentina, and Brazil, and is overexposed to a dangerous extent, the World Bank is much more diversified and less vulnerable to that kind of thing.
There's one over here, please. And then why doesn't the other mic go to the woman over there standing by the guy with the mic?
I'm Roger Leeds from Johns Hopkins SAIS. Although it hasn't been discussed this morning, the subtitle of your book includes failed states as a topic. I was wondering how you would define that in the context of the book, and also the extent to which the bank under Jim Wolfenson has or has not effectively addressed the problems of failed states, or how has he done it different from other presidents in the past?
Well, I mean, there's a paradox about failed states, which is that it's precisely the concern with failed states since 9/11 which has caused, I think, an upsurge of interest in development issues in Washington. That's why we have the Millennium Challenge account. That's maybe why we have the President's HIV initiative on a bigger scale. And that's why the extreme animosity towards the World Bank, which you saw in the first couple of years of the Bush administration, or the first 18 months maybe under Paul O'Neill, has subsided to a large degree. And I don't think the relations are cordial, but there's no longer this sort of constant effort to denigrate and bash the World Bank, which I think was the case early on. So you've had this sea change in the broader foreign policy community's interest in development because of failed states. And I mean, just to digress into history for a second, this is part of the pattern. The World Bank was created in 1944 at Bretton Woods by FDR and the Allies because they wanted to prevent a repeat of the 1930s when hyperinflation and mass unemployment had led to extremism in Europe and war. Desperation had led to desperate isms. Then the World Bank was expanded greatly in 1960 with the tacking on of the soft loan window. Why? Because in 1959 there was the Cuban Revolution, and there was the fear that if we don't help these developing countries, they will go into the communist column. And the classic development text of the time was Walt Rosto's Stages of Economic Growth, and the subtitle was A Non-Communist Manifesto. So development and security have always been linked up. And whenever security, the geopolitical kaleidoscope shifts a little bit, and people are more worried about failed states, that's when development gets more attention. Now, what does the bank do about it? That's the paradox. Rather little. It's present in failed states all the time, but the central lesson about development in the last 10 years is that basically aid works quite well where you have a government that's trying to do the right things, is headed in the right direction, and you put money in behind them, and you accelerate their progress. Aid is not terribly effective where you have no good policies, no good institutions, and things are falling apart. So, there are certain examples like Bosnia where you kind of had post-war breakdown, where you can sort of pick it up together again, and I described that in some detail about how the World Bank did this, and it is kind of a romantic story, like David said before, of people flying into broken-down Sarajevo airport on C-130 transports and running out of the back to avoid the snipers. But to a significant degree, the bank's role is actually, the effect on failed states is indirect. It's by accelerating the progress of the countries that are making some progress that you create an incentive for the failed states to get their act together. And you insulate the better performing poor countries from contagion by the failed state next door. I mean, if you want to protect Uganda from sort of suffering contagion from Sudan, then you want to help Uganda while it's on the right path and accelerate its progress.
I think we have time for one question if you make it short. Otherwise, I get electrocuted.
Edith Brown-Weiss, chairperson of the inspection panel at the World Bank, otherwise at Georgetown University Law Center. We haven't heard anything about the participation of poor people, the voice of poor people. Why? We haven't heard anything about the values of civil society as services, as viewpoints that must be considered or be considered. Why? What recommendations would you have for making development effective at the local level to ensure that development meets the needs of poor people with their participation?
Well, in my view, all development efforts which produce any kind of economic progress in a country are good for reducing poverty. The correlation between macroeconomic progress and poverty reduction is really rather strong. And so to sort of set up a dichotomy between development on the one hand and helping the poor on the other, I'm not suggesting you necessarily did that, but some people do that. And that is a mistake. Now, on poor people's voice, the World Bank has done a lot. I mean, the idea, as I was saying before, that you can't get a soft loan from the World Bank anymore unless you have a participatory plan at which, the members of the local churches, the teachers, the civil society have been around the table helping to create the national plan. You don't get a loan unless you've done that. So I mean, there's been enormous efforts to bring the voice of the poor to the table. And in fact, as you know, there was an enormous study called The Voices of the Poor, done under this leadership, which precisely tried to capture that piece of it. And I think that's been a positive thing. I think participation, hasn't always been a sort of panacea, but it's basically been on the right track. And so if I left that out, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. But I thought it was, I'm glad you asked the question because you gave me an opportunity to speak to it.
I think on that benediction we'll close. I've been asked to remind you that copies of the book are for sale, I think, from Politics and Prose out in the back, and Sebastian will be happy to autograph your copy at no extra charge.
Sebastian Mallaby is a columnist for the Washington Post. The World's Banker is published by the Penguin Press, member of the Penguin Group. For more information, visit their website at penguin.com. Next week on Public Lives, Reagan chief strategist Dick